Welcome everyone to our roundtable on how can we start advocating for mental health in academia. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start the roundtable. Feel free to turn your video on or keep it off, but please keep your microphone muted. We do have closed captioning. To turn it on or off, you will go to the button at the I think it's second to the end that says a little CC. If it's not appearing on your screen, there should be an option to show subtitle. If it is appearing on your screen and you want to remove it, you will have an option to remove it if you wish so. We will be recording and streaming these sessions, but even if your camera is on, you will not be in it. It will just be the speaker or speakers. But we will be stopping for about 10-15 minutes at the end of this roundtable. So if you would like to talk anonymously in an unrecorded part, you can do that. We want to provide trigger warnings when sensitive subjects will be discussed, and we will aim to do that. But keep in mind that we are not healthcare professionals and we do not provide counseling and therapy. To access collected resources by the team, you can visit the website mindsinacademia.com. Please remain respectful of each other's. If there is inappropriate behavior or Zoom bombing, we will remove the person from the stream, or we will end the meeting. If the meeting gets ended, please check the email you registered under. We will follow up there. If you need help during the IT or during the session, please contact IT via the chat or email minds.conference@gmail.com. And if you have any questions, you can enter it in the chat, or you can send it privately to me. I am the chair of this session and I will read your questions to the speakers. So I guess to start, welcome everyone. My name is Linda and I'm going to be the chair for this session, which will be starting now. We have two amazing speakers as part of this roundtable. So I will let them briefly introduce themselves, just to give us a brief bio, because they could do a better job than I can before we get started into the real content. So Marissa, would you like to start first?
Thank you, Linda. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Marissa Kate Edwards. I'm a lecturer at the University of Queensland Business School in Queensland, Australia. I have a Bachelor of Psychological Science with honours, as well as a PhD in Management and Organisational Psychology. And I do a lot of teaching of undergraduate students in organisational psychology. And as part of that, I focus a lot on stress and well-being, how organisations can create healthy work environments. And a lot of the work that I do, the research that I do, is around academic mental health. I'm also the co-editor of the Journal of Management Education, and we just published a special issue which I co-edited around mental health in business schools. And I also have a number of other projects that are active, most notably Voices of Academia, which I run with some wonderful colleagues from around the world. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Amrit, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Amrit Venkatesh. I'm a postdoc at EPFL Switzerland, where I work on chemistry, particularly physical chemistry. I did my graduate school in the US at Iowa State University, and I, in fact, moved to Europe only at the start of this year. I just wanted to say, well, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I've been doing some mental health advocacy work for a couple of years now, but I've been mainly focusing on my institutions where I've been working and trying and liaising with other mental health advocates and their efforts to improve the conversations that we have had in the institutions that I've worked in. So I'm very honored to be invited to speak here with you all today, and I just look forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much. I guess to start, let's start with why you got involved in advocating for mental health. With that, who would like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to continue if you'd like.
Awesome.
I'm just going to share my screen, and please let me know if you can see my slides. Can you see my slides? Okay, great. I'm glad we are here to talk about such an important topic. And before I kind of talk about how we can start advocating for mental health, I wanted to share a little bit about myself and my own mental health journey, because I think the context is important for everybody to understand. And hopefully many of you might be able to relate with at least some of my own experiences. So I come from India, and coming from the southeastern part of India in Chennai, where mental health is still a taboo. Nobody talks about mental health. Saying that you have a mental health difficulty would be an abomination. Like people are not used to hearing sentences like that. So it's that kind of an environment. My family had a lot of struggles. My mom, I grew up with a single mom, single parent, and to give you a perspective, only about 0.2% of married people in India are divorced. I'm sure a lot of people are struggling, but those struggles are pretty much internal, right? And in that kind of an environment, growing with a single parent is not very common. And so as a young child, throughout my schooling, throughout my university, I went through a lot of struggle, and I didn't really have a lot of open environment to like talk to. And there's also the issue of financial burden of schooling and things like that. And it only came to a certain point in my undergraduate career when I started learning about mental health and the fact that you can actually talk about this. And it's not just me who's going through these difficulties, but there are a number of other people around me who are really struggling, and not just around me, but in fact, people all around the world. And I came to a point where I realized that as a family, me and my mom and my sister, we really needed to start talking about this a lot more, which was in direct contradiction to how our social environment is. And like it's always difficult to be a trailblazer wherever you are, right? And leading some of these conversations within our families, we learned to talk about mental health in a very open way. At a certain point, then when I started thinking about what I wanted to do, what job I should do, balancing multiple interests, I think these are all some potentially common challenges because of which in an early academic career, many of us might be struggling and potentially having a lot of difficulties. These are all some things that I went through. And in that, I had to make some difficult choices, and I ended up in a very toxic research environment. And I spent my better part of my 2 years in a very toxic environment, not knowing how to break free, not really understanding whether it was okay to continue or whether I would be looked up as a failure to break away from that environment, even though I wanted the best for my own health and my own career. And so it was only after a certain point I made those decisions to myself and wanting to break away. And I ended up in a very good institution and graduate school in the US. And over there, I really started talking about this a lot more. I noticed that a lot of students were going through these types of challenges, but they didn't really talk about it. But thankfully, I had a brilliant environment around me. And once I made that switch and started my graduate school in the US, I had a successful graduate career, and now I'm a postdoc at EPFL, but that also means I'm constantly moving. And it comes with its own set of challenges, be it visas, financial struggles, the expectation of having to move in academia, and not to mention, I haven't seen my family in over 3 years. If all goes well, I will actually see them tomorrow, keeping my fingers crossed. So, so I just wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of all of these struggles that I'm sure many of you might relate with at least some of these. And the kind of struggle that I go through on a day-to-day basis for me is trying to achieve work-life, balance, and living with a constant guilt of like not working enough, and dealing with that expectation of wanting to, of being able to like perform, but at the same time wanting to achieve this work-life balance. That kind of a struggle is, I think it like eats at you, and this is something that I kind of go through. So in terms of advocating for mental health, I had a few points that I wanted to share, which is, before I think anybody begin, I think we should all address our own mental health struggles, and therapy is something that's perfectly normal. So before we can actually talk about it, we should have a better insight of what we are going through. And in my opinion, I found starting to talk at a grassroots level like really helpful. I started talking to colleagues in my own research groups. As I start talking about it, people started sharing their stories with me. And then I started listening more. And then there were people in my department who were like, hey, it seems like you would be able to listen to this. And then people would come and share these kind of stories with me. So I would just spend time with people, hanging out in the evenings and then listening to people's stories. And then connecting them with resources and then encouraging them to be open-minded to therapy. So a large part of my time and effort actually goes into activities like this. So I spend a lot of time just talking to my friends, talking to people around me, convincing them that it's perfectly fine to take therapy. I'm not a professional, I'm a friend. I can listen to you, but that does not mean I can really help you overcome the difficulties that you're experiencing. And at a certain point, then even sharing these kind of list of resources, like within your own communities, your research groups, your departments, your colleges, I think that's very impactful. When people kind of look at you as a person who's interested in driving these kind of initiatives. And at a certain point, I started talking about addressing the faculty-student divide, because when students go through something, I'm sure faculty members are going through their own set of struggles. And nobody talks about what happens at the interface in these interactions. Like I brought in a professional to our department to give a lecture. That kind of opened up a lot of conversations, which was nice. This was at my previous institution in the US. And maybe joining a university committee. And then this is something that I did as well. I was a student and the graduate student in postdoc Senate, where I was driving wellness initiatives in the university. And finally, I think once you start kind of building ourselves through this kind of trajectory, then maybe we may be at a stage where we may be more confident to start sharing our own experiences and mental health, potentially research, and social media and news outlets and so on. So maybe with that, I'll stop for now and let Marissa continue from here.
Thanks so much for that. I think that what you've shared is so insightful. So I guess to give you a little bit of background about how I became, I guess I am now a mental health advocate. I always had an interest in stress and coping. That was one of the topics that I studied during my undergraduate degree and then my honours degree in psychology. And then when I moved into a business school and started learning and also teaching about mental health in organisations, that interest it stayed with me, and I learnt a lot about wellness in work settings and the various interventions and steps that organisations can take to make work environments healthier. So that was always something that had interested me. And then I completed my PhD, and it was about whistleblowing and disclosure of concerns about organisational wrongdoing. So I've always had kind of this interest in, why don't people speak up about things? What are some of the factors that prevent them from disclosing experiences or concerns? And I had a pretty good PhD experience compared to some. I had wonderful supervisors. I got to travel overseas every year from Australia to the US for conferences. I was extremely well funded. I published a lot, but I still found it really stressful. I don't think that there's any PhD student who has a particularly smooth ride. And certainly towards the end, I was finding, I was working really long hours. I was very tired, just wanted to quit, never wanted to read my thesis ever again. And I think most people can relate to that. Then I moved into a series of casual or adjunct appointments. So between 2012 and 2018, I was constantly teaching, and I was doing this for financial reasons and also to get teaching experience that would hopefully lead to a tenured position. And at the same time, I was obviously trying to publish, and I found myself getting more and more burnt out, exhausted. I'm a big perfectionist, or I'm a recovering perfectionist, as I like to say now. And I was a workaholic, and I became quite sick. I developed an autoimmune condition that I'm medicated for today and probably will be for the rest of my life. And I really experienced some significant periods of burnout. And I realized that at the same time, I had a lot of colleagues around me who seemed to be experiencing kind of similar emotions and similar mental health struggles. And I thought, this can't be normal. This can't be right. And this was happening at universities like here in Australia, but also overseas. And then I got my tenured position in 2019, and I started kind of looking for a research track or a research topic. And I thought, why don't I look at the environment around me and apply what I already know about stress and coping and negative emotions and mental health in organizations. And I think that it really nicely coincided with this movement that has been happening in academia toward better psychological health, better work-life balance, recognition that we need to have a life outside of our dissertation and outside of our work commitments. So I think that it was a little fortuitous that I happened to be wanting to look at a new research topic and really found one in my own work environment. And then I realized that there was a lot of research happening. So those of you who are familiar with the research publications will know that there have been a lot of really significant studies coming out in the last couple of years. So there really is this movement both on social media and within our universities, and also within the research community, to really start looking at people's experiences in academia. And it's indicating that there really are some quite significant concerns around mental health. I think the most recent meta-analysis revealed around 17 to 20% of PhD students will experience clinically significant anxiety or depression during their candidature. So that's lower than some of the other studies, which have said kind of 39, 40%. But this meta-analysis, you've still got about 1 in 5 PhD students experiencing mental health issues, and that's really concerning. So in terms of advocacy, I've done all kinds of things, and I never really planned for it to happen. It kind of happened organically. I think that I've done a lot of work on social media with my wonderful team, especially from Voices of Academia. We're so grateful to all of our readers and everyone who's contributed to our blog about sharing their experiences of mental health. If you are interested in being a part of it, you can go to voicesofacademia.com. That's my little plug. But I do other things. And I think that a really important part of being an advocate is role modeling behaviors. And I think that that's already kind of been mentioned here. But I will go into faculty meetings and people will ask me, in front of everyone else, how are you? How was your weekend? And I'll say, I don't work weekends. I had a great weekend. I went hiking, or I went swimming, or I spent time with family and friends. And I have colleagues just looking at me and saying, how can you have the time to do that? And I make very clear that now I set boundaries. And I think that it's a lot easier to do once you have a permanent role. I acknowledge that. I never used to do that. But I think I try really hard to say to my colleagues, you have most of us have a choice here, in that we can choose to prioritize what we consider to be important. So I will let deadlines slide. If I feel like I need 8 or 9 hours of sleep, I can do that tomorrow. I really am at a point in my life where I prioritize my health, and I try to encourage my colleagues to do that as well. I also thought it would be, we may touch on this later, but I didn't expect the degree of resistance when I started advocating for mental health in academia. There are certainly still people out there who think that it is okay to treat students, and particularly early career academics, very poorly. There are still people who prioritize their work over everything else, who don't encourage healthy work-life balance. And I think that if you're going to advocate for mental health, you need to be aware that there will be that resistance present, and really believe in yourself and believe in your cause. And I think that that really helps to counter some of that frustration and some of that difficulty of coming up against those attitudes. There are still people who say, don't speak up about problems, or if you don't like it where you are, just leave, don't try and change the culture. If you take that approach, change will never happen. And I don't think that change is necessarily easy. It is going to take a long time. But I think that if we have enough passionate and committed people, it's possible. And another big part, as has already been mentioned, connecting with people. You cannot effectively advocate on your own. And I think that's where social media and instances like this conference are so important, because shared advocacy provides resources, but it also provides support when you're really struggling, after you're drained of emotional energy. You can talk to people and they can empathize with what you're going through. So I think that's probably my journey so far. If we want to move on to the next question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing. I think it's great when anyone is open to talking about their journey, and especially when people are advocating, it can seem like such a difficult thing to start when you're looking at someone who seems like they're so established from the outside. I guess one question we did have is how can you bring attention to stigmas, to problems that are in your environment effectively? Because it can be very difficult. People can get used to what the status quo is. They can get used to, they just accept that it's part of the way it is. So how can you deal with that?
I can answer this one first if you like. I think that it is really challenging when you come up against these really strong established norms and expectations in academia, because we know so much of the problems here are cultural, and cultural change is incredibly difficult. As has been often quoted, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have a wonderful mental health strategy, but if you have a culture that is not going to support the changes that you want to make, you're probably going to find that really difficult. In terms of challenging stigmas, I think that being open about our struggles is so important, and this is something that my university has really encouraged as part of Mental Health Week, for example. Each year, we've had staff members share their experiences with mental illness, and despite all my training, I was really surprised when one of our colleagues shared that he'd been treated for clinical depression. I never would have thought that this person, they were always smiling, happy, so helpful, so engaging, and it's just that idea of masking. You never, it's the last person that you would expect is experiencing mental illness. So I think that it's that idea that if we share our struggles, we are not alone. We learn that, and I think that sharing our struggles also challenges this idea that if you have a mental illness, you can't be productive, you can't be successful. I think that the vast majority of people with mental illness, we're living our lives and we are contributing meaningfully. And I think that one of the most powerful ways we can challenge stigma is by sharing our experiences. I also think that collective action is really helpful, and this is where having allies in your workplace can be very helpful, and speaking up. So constantly speaking up to leadership and explaining that, this particular policy is harmful, this particular policy has a negative impact on work-life balance. We successfully, in my organisation, in my department, we successfully advocated for a workload reduction among academics. And we didn't do that specifically, but leadership, they knew that people were struggling. They'd taken the initiative, they'd surveyed us, they knew that we were really having a lot of difficulty, particularly in the COVID-19 environment. And our head of school decided to give all of the staff members who were teaching courses a really significant workload reduction. So really difficult to do, but it was very successful. And I think that it gave people their weekends back. And that question in the chat about speaking up, people, yeah, it's difficult. And I think that's, as I said, you can't speak up on your own. I think you can, but it's much more difficult. And that's where I think that identifying people around you who are willing to engage with you collectively and support you. It's one thing to kind of go up against someone in a position of power on your own. It's different if you've got 6 or 7 people, because collectively that power might just make a difference. And there are all kinds of kind of influence strategies and different approaches you can take. But I think that drawing attention to your experiences, documenting everything, engaging in that collective action can be really helpful.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. Do you want to speak a bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, the only other point that I was going to add to this was, I think it's really important for institutions to start having or opportunities for people for whom mental health is a disability, right? Like a lot of times, we are talking about, honestly speaking, we are talking about the group of people, including ourselves, for whom we experience struggle, but that does not absolutely stop us from doing our work in any way, right? Like you probably have, bad days, you probably have good days, but there are people, a number of them, for whom moving forward is just impossible. Like they probably wouldn't be able to do anything for months at a time. And then they would probably be able to do something during a couple of months in a year. So it's a serious disability. And there must be some sort of opportunity and provision to be included, but this is not something that's currently available right now. So if institutions have to be more open, I think the first change that we should all be driving towards is, making opportunities for people for whom it's an impossibility. When that becomes normalized, I think then we can more easily start talking about people who are having mental health struggles on a day-to-day basis, and then potentially going forward from there. So maybe that is the only other point that kind of came up after all of those excellent points that Marissa mentioned.
Thank you very much. And we did get a very important question in the chat, which I think has been not only come up in terms of academic mental health, but in any activist advocate space, and that is advocate burnout, because it seems to be more and more prevalent. So how do you balance speaking up and advocating when you are struggling without burning out even more? Often there is limited energy. Advocacy can slip to the bottom of priorities due to workload and other expectations to keep yourself well sometimes. So have you experienced this, and how did you deal with it? Or do you know people who have experienced this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can speak for myself when I say that when you look at social media and a lot of the mental health conversations, you look up and then you feel like, yes, I also feel like doing a whole lot more. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I have the time and the energy to put in that much amount of work. But that does not mean that I'm any less passionate about it, right? So if you're interested, don't really worry about putting in a certain number of hours. I would say, like, we should just do our best. If I have a couple of hours, whenever I have a few hours to think about it, like, it would be best to take a step forward, right? And if nothing happens for several weeks, that's completely fine. because you are trying to do something out of the goodness of your heart as a service, to the community. And when your job comes first and you're already struggling to move forward with doing your job, I think then this can become extremely hard. Like I went through this, I was doing a fair amount of work in my grad school where I had a comfortable environment, but then I just moved to a different country. I moved to a different university. I have no idea how things work here. And if I can actually do something, it takes a lot of time to then get comfortable in a new environment and then to actually start talking to people about this. And so I think these are very organic and that we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. And then to get to a point where we feel the burnout, because as the person said, I think that's absolutely right. Like burnout is very real in any activity. So we should not be too hard on ourselves, I think. Self-care is important, but maybe we'll talk more about that later.
Absolutely.
To add to that, I agree completely. And I think that what maybe some people don't realize is that most of us do our advocacy around our work, our family commitments, etc. For me, I just make sure I put my health and my well-being first. I really try not to compromise on sleep. I really try to keep my weekends free. I start saying no if I know I'm going to get overwhelmed. And I think that this is where it can be really useful to plan your activities as well. Once you get to a point where you know that you're going to be advocating for mental health, next month is mental health month. Every single week I'm packed full of activities at work and on social media, but I know that November and December will be a bit quieter. So I think it's really just a matter of like anything, working out, how can I prioritize my own well-being first, and then recognize, you're not alone in this. You don't have to do everything. You can say no. Talk to other advocates as well. I mean, I do this within my Voices of Academia team. Even next week, in fact, my dad, the week after next, is having surgery. I was booked to do a talk. I said, family comes first. I'm not going to do this talk about mental health. Can someone else step in? And Emily King volunteered to do so. So if you have those communities, it allows you to share the work around and hopefully kind of prevent that burnout.
Absolutely. I think speaking from a personal perspective, I also find that organization and communities is the best way to avoid burnout. You also have to learn how to say no as well and how to construct those boundaries, which took me a while to learn, but it is very important. So I guess seeing as we're on the topic of taking care of yourself and constructing boundaries, how did you learn how to do that? Because it can be so difficult. You can be so passionate about what you want to do. And I know you touched on this, but how do you actually sit down and say, I'm going to say no, and then in the moment carry through with that?
I can take this one first if you like.
Sure. Yeah.
Like I think that it's really difficult to do, and I think that it's something that you need to practice. And sometimes we anticipate that if I say no, people aren't going to like us, they aren't going to want to work with us again. Often those fears are unfounded. If you give people enough notice and say, I can't do this, or I say no, most people are going to be okay with that. There are ways of saying no that are not, that are less likely to generate that really strong negative reaction. And I think, like for me, and this is after years of therapy, I've just gotten to the point where sometimes I want to do projects, but I know I'm not going to be able to get them done, or my performance is not going to be as effective as it would be. And it's very challenging to do, but the more you do it, I found that it gets easier, particularly when you see the positive effects. You might have said no to a project so you could go on a holiday. Trust me, you will be sitting on that holiday and you'll be relieved that you made that decision. And also recognizing that, if you're strategic in what you choose to do and say no, you can still take on really interesting, important, meaningful work. You don't have to do everything. You just need to try and choose what's most important to you. I don't really have good advice about the boundaries. My whole approach has just been to literally just send the email, send it, and then agonize over it later, because at least then you've made the decision. It's just making that choice. of you are going to put yourself first. And for me, you know, I found if I don't meet a deadline, the sky doesn't fall in. If I say no to a project, it doesn't mean I'm never going to be hired for something again. So I don't know if that's a very clear answer, but I think that you just get to a point where you start saying no and it becomes easier over time.
Yeah, I kind of echo what Marissa said. Saying no is such a hard thing. That's something that I struggle with still today. It's so easy to just take on projects because everything is interesting. I love doing this. Hey, I love doing that. But at the same time, we have to respect our body. We have to respect our health, our family and friends around us, and give everybody, including ourselves and our own body, the time they all deserve. So just having said that, it really helps to make some simple decisions like, I'm not going to work on a Saturday. Maybe start from there, right? And then maybe say then, well, I'm not going to work during the entire weekend. I think that's a very fair negotiation with yourself, because weekends are meant to be weekends, right? And then we'll try to work and do all the work that we need to just during the week. I think this is a process that will probably have to be trained step by step. No new habit can be formed overnight. Things will take several months. So I think you just have to just kind of go down that road and persevere until it just becomes part of your natural process. I mean, from my own experience, I was working every weekend, like throughout graduate school, to a point where I hardly did, not the entire day, a few hours during the weekends, here or there. But still, it got to a point where I did not prioritize what I wanted to do with my own family, with myself during the weekends. But now I'm at a point where I then decide like, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. And it's been going really well. I've been training myself to do this, and it's been going really well. But at the same time, I do have to live with the guilt that I could do more, but I'm not doing enough. But I just have to tell myself that this is not something I need to feel guilty about, because I am respecting myself. I am respecting my wife, and that we all spend the time that we deserve to spend with each other. So I think this is a very natural, healthy process that we should all just strive towards.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I just saw one kind of related comment by Han. I think they said being open about your struggles helps a lot, even without engaging in committees and stuff. And I would just say to that, like, absolutely. I mean, mental health advocacy, the term being an advocacy can be scary. I've had people, they kind of tell that to me sometimes because it seems like you're just doing something extra, something that's out of your, it ties like well into what we are talking about. I think the culture is what needs to change, right? So each of us, you're totally right. We just need to be talking about our struggles openly, and everybody needs to get to a point that the environment around us is sensitized, that we don't need advocates anymore. But we are still a long way from that happening. So we need some of us to be loud enough that the voice can be heard.
Thank you very much. I guess another question we got is finding communities. The question is, interested to hear thoughts on finding communities. I know there's a lot of wonderful communities and organizing online, but in the pandemic remote world, finding communities within institutions can be difficult, and people may not know where to look to. So what are your thoughts on finding a community within your institution or starting one?
Yeah, I can go first, if that's fine. Well, I would say that just connecting with like friends within your own department may be a great place to start. But if that's not an option, reaching out to people on Twitter is usually fantastic. I mean, initially, I was honestly not quite skeptical about like the platform Twitter as such, because it's a significantly open platform. You really don't know who to talk to, who to trust. But I found that people within the academic community are very helpful. Like when you ask questions, they go out of their way to like really provide you with the resources and things that they know and they share. And it's a really nice place to kind of form new friendships. which can seem a bit non-conventional if for many, but I do think that there is a lot of fantastic work kind of going on there. Like there were times when I wanted some resources, and like people shared like surveys of mental health research in their own departments, like things like that. Results of those surveys, like these are all private things, but they were really happy to like share, so that the community can get better. So that kind of gives you an idea for how open people are. And if you were to send me a message, I would always respond. So, so I hope that kind of it gives you an answer.
I think that I really echo those points as well. I think in terms of your own institution, it can be difficult, but I would kind of encourage the idea, or I'd encourage you to think about the idea that there are probably people out there who feel passionately about this issue as well as you. You may just not have connected with them yet. One place I would start is to see whether your university does offer any wellness initiatives or any kind of committees that you could join. I know at the University of Queensland, where I work, staff are offered free mental health first aid training. And that's one way that I've been able to meet other people who are interested in mental health in academia. We also have a wellness ambassador network. So we have networking events over morning tea, now that here in Australia we can have kind of face-to-face interactions again. I think if those kinds of initiatives don't already exist at an institutional level, I'd really encourage you to start your own, because I would say there are people out there who are interested. They just need people to bring them together, and that's where email, social media, etc., are really useful. Got some good questions in the chat as well.
Yes, definitely. So I guess as a PhD student struggling with mental health, how much of my personal issues is it okay to share with my supervisor without affecting the working relationship? In other words, what amount of support is it reasonable to expect from someone who isn't a mental health professional? I'm worried that disclosing my clinical mental health history with my supervisor will bring stigma and that I might be treated differently in a negative way.
I can answer this question if that would. I can start. I think that this is an experience that's going to be different for everyone. No one is going to have the same relationship with their supervisor. No one is going to have the same mental health journey. And I think that ultimately it's a question that only you can answer based on that relationship. I think I personally, if I were in that situation, I would take time to assess what that relationship is like. If you're already having concerns, it may not be the right time to bring that issue up. In terms of support, I mean, there are a lot of PhD advisors who are very open to knowing that their students are struggling and to providing support, to provide them with support. But there are others who wouldn't do that. And I think also it can become challenging in that sometimes PhD advisors or supervisors feel that they do need to take on that responsibility. And I think that as you pointed out, there needs to be clear boundaries in that most of them are not trained mental health professionals, and a PhD student supervisor relationship is very different to a therapist and a client. The bottom line, I would say, is maybe ask other people if you feel comfortable. How is this person likely to respond? But it's really a decision that only you can make based on your assessment of that relationship. And don't feel like you have to disclose. Ultimately, it's up to you to choose whether you disclose or not. But weigh up the possible risks and benefits of doing so.
Yeah, I think what Marissa said was all like perfectly valid points, and I would encourage you to do the same because every relationship, every PhD student's relationship with their advisor is unique, and I think forming a relationship is also equally important, and that includes sharing certain difficulties that you may be going through to the extent that you would like. And because when you do that, I think the advisor also would be able to really understand where we stand, our capabilities, our strengths, our weaknesses a lot better. And that might also factor into assigning projects they would otherwise, give it to somebody else, or maybe avoid them from overloading the person too much, assuming a student is interested. So I do think communicating our preferences and our interests, and how much we can really do, and the difficulties that we may be going through that may inhibit our ability to work in any way, we should be sharing those to our advisor. Because the beauty of research is that there's so much to work on. There's no dearth of ideas. There's no dearth of problems. It's simply a matter of how much am I willing to really, how much energy am I willing to put in? Some students may be perfectly comfortable with working 24/7, and they may just enjoy that. For some, they may just want to set boundaries, and this is all perfectly fine. And to each our own, and that quantity does not mean one research is better and another research is worse, right? That's absolutely not true in research, right? You could end up working on that one idea which would make all the difference. So work with your advisor, feel the relationship, and then if you feel comfortable enough, maybe don't share everything, share a little bit, see how they're taking it, and just maybe go from there is what I would say.
That's a really good point. Sorry, about maybe sharing a little bit and seeing how they respond. That can be quite a little strategic move that you can make. I would also just want to add that if you are really struggling to the point where it is likely to impact your performance as a student, it may be worthwhile even just saying, I have a medical condition, and making clear to your advisor that you don't have to necessarily share the details, but you do have a condition that is going to impact, sometimes your ability to meet deadlines. Because from an advisor's perspective, if they aren't aware that you have some issues going on, they might start, becoming concerned about your performance when they don't have the full picture. And I know there are PhD students who've shared very openly, friends and colleagues of mine overseas, very openly with their advisors that they have quite serious mental health issues, and they've had varying responses. Some people have been very supportive, some haven't. But what I would say is that you don't need to be specific, but it can be helpful to let your advisor know if there is something that is going to affect you as a student. Because if you aren't disclosing that, they don't have the full picture. So if that makes sense, because it can be difficult from an advisor's point of view as well, and your progress as a student if you are struggling with things and not letting people know that there is something impacting you.
Great, thank you so much. And I guess just to mention before we move on, in that certain countries, and I know this varies by country, you can get disability accommodations for mental health diagnoses. So if you are in a country, I don't know what country you're in, but I would check that out. Depending on where you are, it may be an accommodation center or HR, depending on your level, depending on if you are considered an employee or not, because some countries are. And that can be good for getting extra support and getting it in place. So I guess a really important question would be, how do you deal with negative reactions to advocacy? And I know this kind of comes into what we just said, but it happens, whether that be online, whether that be in person, whether it be a senior faculty member who is saying, mental health's not a problem, you're making it a problem. How do you deal with that?
I can probably start taking this if that's fine. I think the more common problem that you would probably encounter is the fact that people don't care. Like even if you go tell somebody that this is a problem, and whether the fact that, well, this conference is happening, why don't you come join this event? People don't care because they don't think it's really important, right? And unless you connect with somebody on a personal level, it's very difficult to convince somebody that this is important. And then, of course, there are those select group of individuals who will come and tell you, well, what you're doing is not important. Well, I mean, if somebody ever tells you that, I would just let it go through 1 year and let it go out through the other, right? Like, I'm not going to care too much if somebody says that, because then they obviously have a problem. with processing how important this is. I think the best that we can do is, just be a speaker, just like an audio speaker, right? Like you can only keep, there should only be a constant stream of output, and you can only hope that a small fraction of the people you're talking to are being benefited in ways that you cannot even imagine. And that does happen. And, and that's how really change begins, right? I don't think anybody is capable of transforming every single individual that we come in contact with. But we are certainly going to transform, a significant amount of people, the more people we talk to. And so I think that would be the approach that, I would kind of take, and not really be bogged down if somebody tells that this is not important, because, there are plenty of research articles and plenty of evidence and conversations to back up why this is important, especially at this stage of our lives.
I agree with all of that. And I've found in my interactions with sort of more senior people who do happen to be older in a lot of cases, I don't want to sound ageist, but they often are from a different generation who have gone through academia, where these issues were not talked about. It's not conversations that they're necessarily used to having. I found that pointing to the recent research and pointing to the major changes in academia over the last 10 or 20 years, managerialism, casualization, increased workloads, pointing them to research showing that mental health is a problem around the world in academia, across different disciplines, that provides evidence, that supports your argument, and it makes it more persuasive. So I think that that's why I think research is so valuable, sharing those lived experiences, pointing to those examples. And I think it's just a matter of demonstrating that this is a real issue, and it's an issue deserving of attention and advocacy. I've just found that I've become more outspoken, even with senior staff members who might be dismissive, who encourage me to take on really quite ridiculous workloads, for example. I say no, and I think that's part of our advocacy is role modeling the behaviours that we want to see in others, and speaking up and challenging those expectations and actually saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I think that's part of that conversation as well. And when people see you doing it, they might become more inclined to do it as well.
Great, thank you both so much. We are nearly coming up on time, but we have a couple of more important questions. So I'm going to kind of combine two of them because they're along a similar theme. And it says, some institutions are developing mental health strategies. How can we make sure that institutions include advocates, but also that if they have internal committees, that they're representative, so that we can actually make contributions, and that it's not, what do I mean to say? Mental health is not a one size fits all. There's a lot of diversity of experience, and especially when we include things like minority stress, discrimination, bullying, and harassment. If you don't have these people on your committee, if you don't have these people represented, you're not going to get that point of view. So how can we make sure that the strategies are actually going to help people?
Yeah, I could probably start answering this one. I think this is such an important point. And I think I maybe touched upon this briefly in my talk at the start. It's really useful to find a graduate student organization within your department or organization or your university, especially if it is a larger organization like the Student Senate, like the graduate student equivalent of a student government, or something equivalent for postdocs for that matter. I think those organizations are usually represented in university-wide committees, but of course that may vary from university to university. At least the two universities that I've been in, I've seen that those organizations do have a say in placing a few people from within their organizations into various committees across campus, even into small committees like issuing parking tickets. Like there are like random committees where they place students in. And so, but that is not to say that this is a fact. So you might want to check if that's true within your own institution. And if that is true, that would be a fantastic place to kind of start making a change, because you get into a student senate, and then you can start advocating for why this is important. And like the students that are placed in these different committees, can potentially be those who are more cognizant of mental health advocacy and speaking out about the issues that we talked about, and potentially that might help to address the bridge that you're talking about.
I think those are some great points there that you've mentioned. With respect to that question from Christina about barriers to joining those committees, I think that it is challenging when it's the same people on the committees all the time. I would be pointing to other examples of universities that do have advocates on committees and demonstrating the difference that having those different voices can make. I would actively question, are there opportunities? Why is it that you can only join at the start of your PhD? Why is that the rule? What's the rationale for that? So I think that actively questioning those barriers and asking, are they relevant? What's the rationale for them? And pointing to examples of other places that have successfully had advocates involved, for example, in developing mental health strategies and identifying the value that advocates can bring to those committees, whether there's reports, whether there's research studies about having the lived experience. That's really important in the clinical space, actually having people with that lived experience to bring to various initiatives. If we can translate that into the university context, I think that it makes quite a strong argument for having a role for mental health advocates in developing strategies and being on those committees to keep talking about these issues.
Thank you so much. I think that there's a great points. We're very much coming up on time. So is there anything that either of you would like to say, or any points that you'd like to get across before we end?
Yeah, there's one point that I did want to mention, and that really comes down to self-care. And I think we touched upon this in across the session in many ways. But I do think that, within our own communities, within our own small microcosm research groups, research environments, groups of 4 or 5, I think Marissa mentioned this before too, talking openly about conversations where you're actively prioritizing yourself or your mental health, because people don't do this in public. When somebody is working a weekend, people advertise it like, hey, I work last weekend, but when somebody, takes a break, nobody's actually talking about it. So I think we really need to be talking about those things more often in our own environments, because that would encourage, new students, for example, like undergraduate students who look at graduate students, okay, so this life is not too bad. Let me think about doing a graduate school, right? And I think that's how we can slowly start to make the environment more comfortable. And again, that's not something that's going to change overnight, but I definitely think that at least those of us who are here, we can be those people who start to normalize those conversations of taking vacations, taking breaks. What did you do to take care of yourself? I think that really promotes a more amicable environment, an environment that's more open, friendly, maybe more honest. And so those are all definitely important steps that we need to kind of keep in the back of our minds. It's not just about addressing the problem we have, but we need to prevent future problems from happening. And that may be one way that we could probably go forward with.
I agree with all of that, and just great points there, Amrit, thank you. And I guess just 3 really brief points, if I can remember them. It's nearly bedtime for me here. The first point is that we have sometimes we have a very narrow definition of what advocacy is. Sitting on committees, presenting at conferences, protesting, however we want to define it. I think what we've mentioned, talking about our own self-care practices, publicly saying, I'm taking a vacation, I'm not working, I'm taking some time off. I do that at Twitter all the time. And even though I have senior colleagues following me, I don't care. I'm going to publicize what I'm doing. And I consider that to be part of advocacy. The second point that I wanted to make is that I actually feel really hopeful about changes in academia. I think that they are going to come. I think that it's going to be very gradual. But I think that when we have enough people who are committed and passionate about the cause, I think that it's something that we should be hopeful about. And the last point is just a tip that I've gained from cognitive behavior therapy that you may or may not be familiar with. But when you're really struggling and trying to decide, should I take a break? Should I engage in self-care? Should I work over the weekend? ask yourself, what would you say to a friend? Because often we say we are so hard on ourselves and we place such high expectations on ourselves that if we've worked already a 40-hour week, we might be saying, I'm just going to work, Saturday morning. What would you say to a friend who just worked, 40 or 50 hours a week? You'd probably say to them, take a break. And I think about how you would treat a friend and think about the language that you would use, because chances are that is going to be much kinder and more compassionate than you will be to yourself. And that's really the goal, to treat yourself how you would treat a loved one. So that's my tip. Talk to yourself and consider what you would say to a friend in a challenging situation.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much. So this is the end of our roundtable. Thank you so much to both our speakers for an amazing discussion, for their amazing sharing and insights. It was just absolutely amazing. And thank you everyone for attending. Our next session, which will be starting in about 8 minutes, is a discussion on overcoming bullying and power abuse in academia, which should be absolutely fascinating. But thank you again for attending, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.